pattern-seeking animal to grab onto some of those patterns that look designed and say, okay, that's where God. Gaps argument is that whenever science fills in the gap, now we know how this works, then you have to find a new gap. And that's why I argue that really, if you're religious, you're better off leaving science out of it so you don't have to chase it down and follow them around all the time. Anyway, in closing, what I've tried to do is a little bit like what Joel does too in his book, is talk about science as not just a process, but something that actually does give us a certain I think, feeling that we are involved in a process bigger than us, a process of finding out about the world. This is a wonderful thing. And even if it turns out there are no aliens, maybe if the rare earth hypothesis is true and evolution is incredibly contingent. And I just reviewed Bob Wright's book, Non-Zero, for the LA Times. You know this book? Evolution is directional, it's purposeful. If you rewound the tape in Gould's thought experiment, played it back again and again, humans would appear over and over again. And you can actually test this hypothesis. You can just say, okay, let's take humans out of the fossil record and just start with Neanderthals. Now, it's very improbable to even get to Neanderthals. There's a billion little contingent steps to get all the way up to a primate with a brain that size that's making tools and so on. But even if you just took Neanderthals, we have the test. They were in Europe for 200,000 years, and they didn't do a damn thing. They weren't becoming us. They weren't on their way to becoming human. Their tools don't progress. They had no art. They weren't becoming human. That's the problem with that progressivist view in science, that somehow, I'm tempted when I debate creationists to use the polar bear example as a living fossil transitional species between a land mammal and a marine mammal. Because it's beautifully adapted for spending time on both the land and in the sea. You know, it's got webbed paws, lots of blubber, and so on and so forth. But that's not right, because the polar bear is not becoming a marine mammal. It's not becoming anything. It's just well adapted to do exactly what it does. It might become a marine mammal, maybe the global warming, the polar ice caps melt, it has to go extinct or go into whatever, or it might go extinct. It may not become anything, who knows? So, and so that's the problem with that sort of temptation to take science. What makes me nervous about that, because I like to do it myself, is take science and make it something bigger. That in this materialistic worldview, we can find purpose and meaning through somehow some direction, some purpose in the evolutionary process. But I think it's not there. I think ultimately the purpose is only up here that we find for ourselves. Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to start off with something that has nothing to do with my talk. And the reason is I'm kind of fascinated at this pattern business. You see it everywhere, and we really are good at seeing patterns. And I just got to show a couple here. We heard a mention of the face on Mars. And I love this cover from the Weekly World News a few years ago. Anybody recognize this is a celebrity? This is Grimshaw. But down here in the corner, you can see it, is the famous face on Mars. And when I turned back to that page, it said that it was computer enhanced. I thought, you can run a computer enhancement program. You know, what if we run it again? And so I got the original NASA photograph. And there you can see the face in the upper left there. And I ran my computer enhancement program. If we've got an intelligent race out there and they've chosen Michael Jackson, our government gets the right to cover it up. But that photograph is 20-some years old. That was Lightning. And of course, with the new mission Mars, we have new photographs of the Cydonia region in which that exists. And here is one of that very same spot. It's about a mile across, but now there are pictures in higher resolution. I'm sorry that my copy here is not perfect, but there it is. There's the face on Mars, and lo and behold, it's not Michael Jackson at all, it's Ted Kennedy. And that is not what my talk is about. Actually, voodoo science is a target-rich field, and so I'm kind of free to talk about a lot of it. But let me talk about something that is a current and serious problem going on right now. We're approaching next week an anniversary of sorts. 10 years ago, on March 29th, there was an article published in Nature magazine by Michael Salomon of the University of Utah. Now, Michael Salomon was in the physics department, an expert on neutron detection, and he had been pressured because of the controversy over cold fusion to make measurements on the Pons and Fleischmann experiment. If you recall, one of the claims that had been made by Pons and Fleischmann a year earlier was that, in fact, they detected neutrons coming from their cell. And now, you might think there was something wrong right off, because, I mean, here are these guys in a picture that was seen all over the world, Pons on the left and Fleischmann on the right, and they're holding what should have been the hottest source this side of Chernobyl. Michael Salomon and his, when he did this carefully, Pons and Fleischmann were not experts in making measurements on neutrons. Salomon was, and he published his results. He found no neutrons above background level at all coming from their experiment. And so the result of that, however, is indicated here in the Wall Street Journal article of the 6th of June, 1990, a couple of months after he published the article. He got a letter from Pons' lawyer demanding that he retract his paper that he published in Nature. So of course he refused, and ultimately, in fact, the lawyer was then to apologize. But in fact, history has a way of repeating itself. This is from Nature magazine last week. New form of hydrogen power provokes skepticism. And if in the room we were originally scheduled in, believe me, you could have read this, but in this one you obviously can't. A law firm representing the energy company Blacklight Power Incorporated of Cranbury, New Jersey, sent letters earlier this month to Nobel laureate Philip Anderson of Princeton and others. It says here requesting that they stop making defamatory comment. I think my letter said demand, but at any rate, there is also in that story in Nature a wonderful cartoon that sort of encapsulates the whole issue. Blacklight Power, for those of you who are not familiar, is a company that claims to have a process for extracting energy from ordinary water. And they do this by putting the hydrogen atoms into a state below the ground state, which is good. I mean, if you do that, that will certainly produce energy. Now, this has been around for a while. The discoverer of this process is Randy Mills, who has an MD from Harvard Medical School in 1986. And Randy Mills got caught up in the cold fusion excitement and then tried to do these experiments himself. He made a wonderful discovery. You do not need heavy water. And the reason you don't need heavy water is it's not really fusion. I know you're saying, okay, what's the big deal? The big surprise is not really fusion. What it is, as I say, is putting the hydrogen atoms into this state below the ground state. Okay. Now, there, in fact, there is a nice quote, which others were pointing out to me, in a case from 1994, scientific controversies must be settled by the methods of science rather than the methods of litigation. More papers, more discussion, better data, and more satisfactory models, not larger awards of damages, mark the path toward superior understanding of the world around us. Now, this was Judge Estabrook at the Federal Appeals Court in the case of Underwager versus Salter. Actually, that was another pseudoscience case. It dealt with implanted memories. And at any rate, this is kind of a serious threat. This sort of goes right to the heart of what the scientific process is all about. If in fact you can intimidate people into not criticizing your scientific pronouncements. But what actually prompted these lectures? Well, they came just about 2 weeks after this patent was granted. Patent 6,024,935, February 15, 2000, granted to Randall Mills for a lower energy hydrogen methods. And that is the state below the ground state. And when you put it in this state, it produces a tiny sort of little hydrogen atom called a hydrino. And so he, in addition to getting the free energy, he's got a whole chemistry of hydrinos that he is promoting with his company. He referred to this in an interview with the Princeton packet. Now, his company originally, back the first item of it, back in 1991, 2 years after the cold fusion, was when he first announced this in a press conference in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, his discovery of this state below the ground state. And a few months later, he formed a company called Hydrocatalysis Incorporated. Now, Hydrocatalysis Incorporated, sort of a language. You would have thought that a startling discovery like that might have moved a little faster. It languished for several years, but eventually was reorganized and came out as Black Light Power. And maybe it was the change of the name, or maybe it was just the run-up in the stock market, which has given deep-pocket investors a lot of money, and a lot of it goes into riskier technologies, which is not an unreasonable strategy as long as the odds are not zero. Now, incidentally, he is also the author, I love the title of his book, The Grand Unified Theory of Classical Quantum Mechanics. And he says that, quantum mechanics has all wrong. It's really classical physics, and he just has to understand it better. And his Grand Unified Theory explains everything. I mean, you've got questions about the Big Bang, anything else, he's got the answer in about 1,000 pages. Now, we got a patent. That raises an interesting question. What I want to talk about a little bit is patent right now, and what seems to be going on in the patent office. To what extent does getting a patent represent scientific validation? Well, this was issued on February 15, 2000. Let's look at another patent issued the very same day. Someone named David Strong for a hyper light speed antenna. And I'm not making this up. This is the wording directly from the patent. The present invention takes a transmission of energy, and instead of sending it through the normal time and space, it pokes a small hole into another dimension. There, sending the energy through a place which allows transmission of energy to exceed the speed of light. I mean, this got a United States patent. And my first reaction when I heard about this was that this is an urban myth. That these stories go around, and this couldn't be real. It was not until I went to the patent office site, pulled up the patent, and there it was, in black and white. I'm still done. I hope that this is some kind of a gigantic prank by somebody within the patent office. That this is not real. But from every indication, this patent really exists. And it has other wonderful benefits. Once you got that hole poked into this other dimension, if you put plants near the hole, it turns out that it enhances plant growth. Coming through that hole from the other dimension. So it's good for your begonias. So let's look back at the kind of history of patents for devices that give you free energy in one way or another. Let's go way back before the patent office. The idea of perpetual motion machines has attracted people for many, many years. 1618, there was an English physician named Robert Flood. At that time, water wheels were used all over Europe to grind grain. But unless you had a suitable stream, it meant that you had to lug your grain to some distant mill and have it ground into meal and then lug it back. And so Robert Flood, in what he thought would be a service to humanity, came up with an idea to ease the burden of these farmers by producing a water wheel that you could use anywhere, even if you didn't have a suitable stream. What you would do is have the water run down the mill race, turn the mill wheel, and in addition to grinding the grain, it would operate what is called Archimedes screw, which would essentially pump the water back up into the mill race again. And so that way, with just a small reservoir of water, you could essentially operate wherever and grind your grain without a mill stream. Well, it didn't work. But in fact, Robert Flood, in proposing that invention, made an important contribution to science. It was one of the things that stimulated people to start thinking about what came to be known as the conservation of energy. But that was really another 200 years before that was clearly enunciated. But it was one of the things that precipitated the progress toward the conservation of energy, which now is sort of the foundation on which all modern science is built. Well, actually, even though Robert Flood was unsuccessful, for those who are fans of Escher, he managed to do it. He's got a water wheel here, and as you can see, the water runs the water wheel, flows downhill, and somehow winds up at the top again. And continue from there. But that may not have been practical either. Now, the patent office in the 19th century was really the great era of inventors of these kinds of classical machines that were designed to somehow beat the laws of thermodynamics. The laws of thermodynamics always won. But often, in frustration and perhaps embarrassment, the inventors resorted to fraud. But every fraud exposed, every failure to build a perpetual motion machine just established the laws of thermodynamics more firmly. And by 1911, examining these impossible machines that he established a new rule for the patent office. He said, in order to apply for a patent for a perpetual motion machine, you must file a working model with the patent office, and if it's still running at the end of a year, you can file your application. Well, that pretty much brought an end to the pretty much ended the application for perpetual voting machine for a while. But then in the I think 1982 or 3, there was a sort of a breakthrough. There was a new application for a machine that produced more energy than it took to run it, and the patent office rejected it on the grounds that we do not patent perpetual motion machines. However, the old rule no longer applied. And the reason was that the patent office had long since stopped requiring models to, the patent office no longer examines a model of your invention as they once did. And so Newman said, well, your rule doesn't apply to me anyway, because it's not a perpetual motion machine. He said, in fact, it's just using modern science. It all goes back to Einstein, and what's happening is that the copper wires and iron cores of this device are gradually being converted into energy, but the mass is so great with E equal mc squared that this thing will essentially run forever. Well, he sued the patent office to issue a patent. Here is from a newspaper story at the time. This is his machine. It is essentially a motor generator. But it's an unusual motor generator in that it had an enormous number of turns in the armature, which in fact Joe Newman and his wife actually wound by hand in their kitchen. And now, Joe Newman, who had only a grade school education, was a sort of a self-taught mechanic, and he had taken a course in electricity and had made a wonderful discovery. He found that if you take a turn of wire, you get a certain magnetic field when you pass a current through it. Take a second turn, you get twice the field with the same current. He said, now you got to be able to do something with that. But if I get enough turns on there, I must be able to produce a machine that produces more energy than it takes to run it. And now, however, he never got quite around to closing the loop. It actually ran off of batteries, but he claimed the output was much greater than the input. In fact, he demonstrated this in the Superdome in New Orleans. Eventually, he put one of these under the hood of a Sterling sports car, which he could drive at a sort of stately 4 miles per hour around the floor of the Superdome, and he would jump out of the car and hold up a transistor radio battery, and he would say, can you believe that this car was running on the current of a single transistor battery? Well, it was, in a sense. It was the current through a single battery. What he did not tell you was that there were 1,800 more batteries in series. Well, through them all. And so what he had done, of course, with this enormous number of turns, was build a motor that ran on a very small current and a very large voltage, and it was not a perpetual motion machine. But in his case against the patent office, the judge turned out to be Robert Penfield Jackson. Now, for those of you who have seen his news recently, That's the judge that ruled against Microsoft. And Jackson was anticipating, in fact, a decision that is now known as the Dover decision. The Dover decision of the Supreme Court says that it is the responsibility of the federal judge to act as a gatekeeper, to see to it that the juries are not given information which is unscientific. And it doesn't tell them how to do that. And there have been subsequent decisions that begin to clarify that. And so in the long run, Dover will have an enormous effect. The effect is still rather small, but the result of all this was that in fact there was a decision. What the judge decided to do first was to hire a master, an outsider who could come in and advise him. And they got a former patent examiner as a master to advise the court. And he said, looks to him like it works just like Joe Newman said. And now the judge acknowledged that he was not a scientist, but somehow that did not sound quite right. So he ordered Joe Newman to turn the machine over to the National Bureau of Standards for testing. That's kind of interesting. Turned out the National Bureau of Standards knew Joe Newman. He had first written to them in 1976. Now we're up to 1986. He had written to them asking them to test his invention. And they asked for more details, which he apparently never sent. And a few years later, he actually showed up in 1982. He showed up at the Bureau of Standards with his machine. And he pleaded with them to test it. And they said, no. You still have not explained how this machine works, and we're not going to take the time to test it. When the judge ordered him to turn it over to the Bureau of Standards in 1986, 4 years later, his lawyers fought the judge's order. Now, what had happened in the 4 years that had transpired? Well, kind of the theme that I point to in my book is that we all in a scientific career come to points at which we realize we have made a mistake. Very few of us are ever going to escape that. And now, you have a fork in the road at this point. In one direction is acknowledgement that yes, it looks like I may have made a mistake, and other people have better check this. In the other direction is denial. And we often go through a denial phase for a while. We do the experiments over to see if they won't come out better the next time. Or we find reasons not to do the critical experiment that might settle the, you can always concoct reasons not to do the critical experiment. But then as time goes on, as you go down that road of denial further and further, the more publicly you have made your claim, and the more forcefully you've made your claim, the less likely it is that you're ever going to turn around. And at the end of that road lies fraud. If you stay on that road long enough, you eventually get to the point where you never want to underestimate the human capacity for self-deception. But somewhere along the way, it makes that transition. Now, there is a whole industry out there right now in people that claim to produce energy. And once again, unlike the 19th century, the claims now all have to do with new physics. They all involve new discoveries of remarkable new properties or new states below the ground state. All except one. This was an ad in USA Today last fall. Tired of high electric bills? How about no electric bills? This machine may give you free electricity for the rest of your life. It turns out to be a machine, and in fact, this potential motion change that didn't work. But they fooled people then, and they fool people now, and he's managed to get considerable investment. In fact, Blacklight Power has also got substantial investment. They have raised about $20 million by their account, or more, from private power companies and other deep-pocket investors. And this is an ad in the last issue of Science Magazine. They are hiring people now that they have their patent. And so for those of you who are interested, there are opportunities in the free energy field. And that's not where I'm going to take us. The issue here is the pre-discussion of scientific questions. And it is not a question of whether claims are right or wrong. It is a question of whether we can openly challenge other people's claims, which is what we do all the time. Of course, squabbling is part of the scientific process. Thank you. We're going to have a problem here on questions because I'm not going to be able to hear you at all. But let's get a young pair of ears like David to come up for a second so you can hear the questions for me. I won't be able to hear you. Oh, come up here. So when somebody asks a question, if you would repeat the question, I would appreciate it. Lynn? Is it possible to revoke a patent? I don't really know, and that's a very good question. I do know that patents can be withdrawn for re-examination before they're actually issued. What happens after they're issued? I suppose they can be. Paul, do you know?
They can be challenged. They can challenge the trademark claim.
Okay, Paul Grant, who is something of an expert on that at the Electric Power Research Institute, says that yes, patents can be challenged.
However, people in the general public are supposed to distinguish between true science, which has some very strange findings, and what we all call pseudoscience.
How is the general public to distinguish between true science and pseudoscience?
Yeah, there's no clear way. There's not even a clear way for us to distinguish between real science and pseudoscience. But the public should certainly hear from us. And that's what the problem is here, is there's an attempt to cut off public discussion so that the public will not hear that there is another side of the issue.
Doesn't this question of dialogue concerning what is real science and what is pseudoscience involve also retraction of objections that have been made that seem to be not sustained? For example, Frank Post said that the functioning ponds affect produced nuclear ash, but the work of Voodoo shows that there is nuclear ash even before. So is that part of the dialogue of science? And we should address that.
So part of the dialogue is in refuting cold fusion and other such ideas involves legitimate scientists needing to refute them or needing to accept their errors. Is that what you're saying?
Well, Frank Post is a very distinguished person. He said nuclear ash is not present in these experiments. Of course, he was looking for helium-3 neutrino, but Voodoo has, in several experiments, really showed quantitative evidence of helium-4 produced in 24 degrees for helium-4 in recent experiments. And as far as I know, there's been no study or discussion as to whether this nuclear quantity is real, given the helium-4.
The issue here, there is evidence, in fact, presented at this conference, which is exactly the way it's supposed to work. There were papers in conference dealing with cold fusion, and McCoubry presented one of those papers. And of course, his task is to persuade his colleagues that the new information he's presenting is correct, and presumably, if people think it is, other people will attempt to verify it, and that's the way the scientific process works.
I've known Randall to be trained where it's true. I've found his black light power for 19 years, and I've done research for him. He's sent me samples. He asked me to do short time tomorrow, asked me to confirm the duos. I've done the things according to scientific methods. His analysis is according to scientific methods. I disagree necessarily with how he analyzed it, but he did it scientific. And I wonder why you feel so strongly against what he's doing. Everything he's doing is not for fraud, like some others are 30%. But he actually does have concrete theories that agree with history. He has samples he's going to send to the university for intent analysis. And the results presented from the intent analysis are useful. His analysis you can disagree with, but I can disagree with a lot of these who are here. I wonder why you would like to do it.
That's a good question. As a matter of fact, of course, he has a perfect right to hold his views. However, he has not presented those views in an open scientific forum. He gave one talk at a regional meeting of the American Chemical Society, and that's the extent of it so far. He has not published in the literature. He has not exposed his ideas to the general scientific community, and until he has, as far as the scientific community is concerned, he really hasn't done anything.
I want to raise another question, which is related to suicide. It seems to me that there is a general movement that despises science, that is anti-intellectual in this country, and tries to say that science is bad and leads to things that we don't want. Do you have any familiarity with that?
Yeah, certainly there is an anti-science as well as an anti-science movement within the country. And of course, a lot of that stems from the kind of spiritualism involved in the New Age processes. I relate a lot of that actually to the experience of the Vietnam War, when people sort of became disillusioned by technology. And
How about the atom bomb?
sure, but the atom bomb didn't seem to bother people until after the Vietnam War. In fact, at the end of World War II, as you recall, the people who developed the bomb were regarded as heroes for many years. I still do.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that possibly science can be right valuable in the scientific community. Later on, it refers to the people positions which gave judges the chance to find the jury on what counts as science. There seems to be a tension between them. Which way do you yourself go on that?
There seems to be a tension between judges advising jurors on what science is legitimate, as opposed to the other point of view that ideas need to be exposed to the scientific community, and that's the place to judge science. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think most people agree that the place to decide scientific issues is certainly not in a court of law, but nonetheless, the courts have to deal with issues that do involve scientific evidence. And the question is, how do they decide whether the evidence that's presented is valid? And that's up to the judge to figure out how that's done. Now, what many judges have done, are beginning to do under the Dover decision, is to appoint an independent group of scientists with credentials in that area to review the evidence that's presented and decide whether it meets the test of being scientifically valid and scientifically interpreted. That doesn't mean it's right. It just means whether it's designed to be tested.
Does the APS work with the patent office to try to improve the patent selection process?
Does the APS work with the patent office in an attempt to improve the process there?
No, we have no contact with the patent office at all, and I'm not sure we should. I think that's not really our role. But it's clear that the patent office recognizes as well that they have serious problems right now. There are a lot of reasons for that. The number of patents they have to deal with is just increased enormously, particularly as a result of patents in the software area. So they recognize that there's a problem, I think.
Whatever happened to this machine that this was going to test? What's the news story?
I'm sorry, which machine?
Well, what happened to the machine that the National Bureau of Standards was supposed to test?
Oh, yes. Well, what they found was that the machine produced far less energy than it took to run it, which I think comes as a surprise to no one, and said it was much inferior to the motor generators currently on the market. So, as a result, the judge issued a verdict in a decision that said that indeed it was a worthless perpetual motion machine. The patent was not granted, but even as Robert Flood had made a contribution by building a perpetual motion machine that didn't work, Joe Newman made a contribution in that decision is now part of the patent office rule against. Now the rule is real. The patent office really says in black and white, we do not patent perpetual motion machines. Now the problem is, of course, that Joe Newman claimed this was not a perpetual motion machine, and part of the decision was that it was indeed an attempt to make a perpetual motion machine. But as I say, the difficulty with that is that all of these devices now claim to be do physics of one sort or another. With that,
a little different, but they probably came from the Canadian goose many years ago. But anyway, they're trying to save them from extinction. The threat of exotic animals that didn't originate here, that are endangered, other animals like